Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. It's good to be here once again with you. Now, I tell you, we have got a fascinating show today with a guest and a topic that we have never discussed, because our guest today, John Lawyer, is a 15-year counterintelligence expert with a large portion of his experience in Afghanistan for 10 years and then also in Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq. I can't wait to talk about this stuff, because I've never talked to an expert about this. But John's passion is no longer counterintelligence, but rather more, I would say, a spiritual intelligence. From 12 years desert combat zones to a battle within, John transformed from a soldier to a spiritual seeker, and he is a co-founder of Kishar, I'm sorry, I mispronounced it. Kishar, a nonprofit online spiritual community where people share their journeys and explore their own unique spiritual path. Now, John calls himself an Omnist, which is not committed to any one particular religious doctrine, but believes in the validity of the human thought, of great human thought from around the world and across time. He is a higher purpose and transformational coach. John offers individual spiritual guidance as part of the Kishar Spiritual Community. With that, let's welcome our guest, John Lawyer. Welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I appreciate you having me on the show. Great introduction.
Oh, thank you. Was it accurate?
Yeah, it was accurate.
That's always nice to know. Okay, first of all, you know where I want to start, man. In American TV is in love with counterintelligence and spy stuff. And so I can guess right now all of our audience is fascinated to talk about this. And so I want to begin with that talk before we get into your spiritual journey. But my first question is, I know the term counterintelligence. I have seen The Spy Who Comes In from the Cold. I've read the book. So I know that much about counterintelligence and spy work and all. But my guess is none of us, or at least very few of us, really know anything about counterintelligence. I know what the TV says, but I want to know what you have to say in truth. What is counterintelligence?
Charlie, at its very base level, it's about trying to keep other nations or organizations from spying on us. And if they are spying on us, either to stop them from spying on us or to exploit the fact they're spying on us and feed them this information or what we want to tell them. So it's really about protecting our secrets, and that's at the big level. And it's also about going out and dealing with other human beings, having them help us in these efforts, and also to collect information so that we can have a better picture of what's happening out there from intelligence perspective, so intelligence community can be better protected.
So I imagine your security status is quite high, because I would guess you have information that almost no one else has about United States policy with regard to information in other countries. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's fair. Most counterintelligence special agents are cleared at a pretty high level. They always have a top secret security clearance and usually access to some very specific compartmentalized information. It has to deal with foreign countries and what their intelligence apparatus are doing to spy on us from all different types of perspectives, whether that's human intelligence or signals intelligence, like with NSA type stuff and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's pretty high clearance.
I'm wondering, how does this question just occurred to me, how does that impact your view of world events? Knowing what you just must be, Paul and I, for example, were just talking about Israel and Palestine and particular strategies regarding each of those. But you have to have so much more information, and whether it's about those particular entities or not, you know how these things work, that you must have such a different point of view than the majority of Americans or people in the world would have. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think being able to see what's going on behind the curtain gives you unique perspective on how you view geopolitics and things that are happening around the world. We still use a lot of news and like open source information to decide what's happening around the world and to help us out. And
oh, really?
So it's part of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle, but yeah, definitely a part of the puzzle, the classified part of it. And we do have to combine that with what everybody else knows. And so it's part of the equation.
So what does a day in the life of what is the title of the job? Is I can keep calling it expert. A day in the life of a counterintelligence operative. What would be your word? I don't know what the word is.
I did everything from being an agent or an operative all the way to, I was also an analyst, a counterintelligence analyst. I did both. But a day in the life, oftentimes is probably not as exciting as people think.
That's what I was wondering.
We went to Fort Huachuca, Arizona for a counterintelligence school, the Army. And the first thing they tell us when we sit down in class and our instructors are introducing us first day is that we're not James Bond and not as cool as we think we are. And
you don't get to drive an Aston Martin?
No, I don't. I'm not wearing a Rolex. That basically our job is about 70% paperwork or sitting behind a computer. The other 30% is field work and going out and talking to sources and doing stuff like that, surveillance or counter surveillance and casing places and taking notes on where you're going to meet people and all that kind of stuff. At other times, it's very exciting. You're out in a city, in another country, meeting people and trying to get them to tell you things that they don't necessarily want to tell you or things they shouldn't tell you and go against their own self-interest or against their own country's self-interest. And it's very exciting. And if you're doing counterintelligence at a very kind of tactical level on the battlefield, you're meeting sources to try to keep your base safe or facility safe. And then you have to go and like information together and say, okay, this guy's telling me where the bad guys are, the quote unquote enemy, and I have to go and we have to go take care of that. So there's definitely an exciting part to it. And there's also, like I said, there's a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of studying that goes along with it.
Especially in the analyst part, I would imagine that would be a lot of
I think that I really like the analyst part because at some point sometimes it was almost more exciting being an analyst because you're sitting there analyzing something and taking bits and pieces from different intelligence disciplines like from signals intelligence from calls, or you're taking it from human intelligence sources and people are meeting, and you're taking it from imagery or drone footage. You're putting it all together. So sometimes that's actually more interesting than just going out and meeting people.
Now, when you go out and meet people, would that be an operative? Is that what that is?
Yeah, you're just going out, and yes, you're basically a counterintelligence operative or agent.
Are you disclosing your identity? Are you hiding that? Are you pretending to be? Is this like a spy movie kind of thing? Obviously, I don't know anything on, so I'm just really curious.
On the military side, where we were doing it, it was typically your asset would know that you were, like they would know we were Department of Defense.
Okay.
And they would know that. So now they're at higher levels on the operative side for both the DOD and the CIA. Obviously, there's non-official cover where they don't understand that you're coming from the U.S. government. And I dealt with that on the analytical side and support from that perspective. As an operative, I didn't do that. I only did it when we were known as DOD.
How in the world, how do you convince someone in another country to disclose information that could harm their country? I may be getting deeper than I want to in this, but I'm just wondering, what tactics do you use to get them to do such a thing?
That's a great question, and actually gets at the heart of a lot of heartache for counterintelligence trying to figure out the best way to approach assets and get them to do what they need
assets.
To do.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously, money is a big one. I would say. Money is the biggest. Money is the biggest thing. And then there's other things like pride and ego can play a place. Sometimes the asset wants to think that they're James Bond and that they're a spy and that they're doing this cool guy stuff. And so you can play up on their pride and ego. Like that can be a motivation, a power. I feel if they're looking for power and maybe you can help them increase their power in a certain aspect, that also goes back to money sometimes, because power tends to end up with them having more money. There's different things. It's obviously more complicated than all of that, but that's just some.
Oh, of course. I'm pretending you and I are sitting in a living room talking. That's always the way I do my shows. I never pour audience. I don't pay attention to audience as much as our conversation. So this may be, my question may be something you can't even address. It's just too confidential. But I'm just curious, what kind of money are we talking about? Are we talking $5,000, $50,000, $500,000? What kind of money does it take? Is it?
The easiest question, or the easiest way to answer that question would be yes. Varies. Varies on the source and asset, and also varies on the organization that is getting the money out. So, like within the DoD, depends on what level you're operating at, and how much money and funds that you have. And obviously, an organization like the CIA or other entities like that have obviously greater access to funds and stuff like that. So it really depends on what level you're operating on, what organization that you're with, and what budget they have. And that's a very competitive thing. Different units are always trying to get more money for their budget.
Yep.
But I would say that people would probably be amazed at what is done for sometimes fairly lower amounts of money.
Yeah, I bet, because you're talking poor people and that don't have those kind of resources. So I'm going to ask you one more question on this, and then I promise I'll get off it. But I'm just wondering, you worked in the government sector and you worked in the private sector. You did 5 years in the Army, as I understand, and then another decade or so in the private sector. Does the job look the same in both organizations, if I may, or are there significant differences between the private sector and the government sector?
So for me, I was working after I got out of the Army after my 5 years, became a civilian doing essentially the same thing. I was working for a private company, but I was essentially working under the command of a military commander. So it was essentially the same job, so it looked very similar. It looked almost the same.
Oh, okay. Now you told me that you ate, slept, and breathed, and it was your whole life. This was your whole life. Was that satisfying for you? Did you really enjoy doing that kind of work?
It's a really complicated question. The easiest answer is yes. I will qualify that with, I really loved what I did. Especially in the beginning, I believed in what we were doing, came to see what we were doing long-term as a darker thing within the military-industrial complex. But it was a great job. I was good at it. It was exciting. And I'm pretty upfront about telling people, and I think a lot of soldiers and people that are involved with war end up this way. But I was a war junkie. I got addicted to it. Exciting work, lit my brain up in a very specific sort of way. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I was helping people. And so in a lot of ways I was, even though we were hurting other people, I was helping a certain group of people.
Right.
So it was complicated. But yeah, I think that's why I was able to stay overseas for 12 years out of the first 15 years of my adult life, is because it was exciting. I felt like I was contributing to something, and it was my purpose. It was a very specific purpose, and I understood what my purpose in the world was.
Now, thank you for that. That will go into my reservoir of every time I watch a spy movie. I'll be thinking of it differently now, or with more information. But I want to skip to your transition, And you told me that, so evidently there must have been some things going on, because you told me that your spiritual journey, because during your time as a counterintelligence, was that really no spiritual path for you, or was there a spiritual journey in the midst of that you were dealing with, wrestling with, or working on?
I'd say that consciously during that time, I was probably agnostic as far as spirituality and faith go.
Okay.
I think I was on a spiritual journey and didn't know it from that, so there's that perspective of it, but I wasn't consciously aware that I was on a journey.
Yeah. Yeah, and I fully believe that our whole life is a matter of, it is a spiritual journey no matter what we think it is. I do believe that we are spiritual beings and that we are developing and growing in ways that we don't even know. But one thing you indicated is that your newer spiritual journey, or your reawakening, actually began with a therapist at the VA. Now, I'm assuming you did not go to a Veterans Administration therapist for spiritual advice, and yet that's what you received. Tell me about that experience. That was fascinating.
Yeah, when I came home in 2015, I really didn't know who I was outside of this machine that I'd been a part of, and was lost. I had no identity. Had PTSD, anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, OCD, pretty much everything. I knew I needed help, asked the VA for help. They partnered me with this therapist, and she practiced Eastern meditation and modalities, mindfulness meditation. She was a hypnotist.
Was she Zen? Was that part, or was it just open to Eastern method?
She was Zen. Yeah, she was definitely Zen, and she was definitely into living the present moment and all that type of stuff. And so it was not something that I had searched for. It was really just like universal fate or destiny that's where I ended up.
So what's that like? How did she get you there? Is that just her normal practice, or were you a special case?
I think that she uses it with a lot of her clients through the VA. And I think for me, she knew I was really broken and I had been exposed to this stuff for a long time. She also helped me understand the spiritual side, yes, but she also helped me understand the physiological aspect of mental health, and the fact that my amygdala and stuff in my brain had been rewired, and I was physiologically rewired. And so I was going to feel a certain way because I had been reprogrammed biochemically. And
oh, really?
I was able to integrate that into spirituality and teach me the other side and say, here's how you can start programming yourself back to the way that you probably need to be, that is normal. And so it was something that I wasn't able to completely wrap myself around. I wasn't completely able to take it all in and accept it, but it definitely contributed to where I am today.
Is it related at all to neuroplasticity, or is that a whole different discipline?
I think that, yes. I think it's the idea and the knowledge that our brain, the physical makeup of our brain, literally changes based on the environment that we're in, the trauma that we go through, or the peace and calm that we experience. Either extreme, our brain is going to adapt to that status quo living and be better or worse.
You know what I want to do? I want to dive deeper into this, and before we do that, I think it's time for us to take a brief break, and then we're going to come in and we're going to do a deep dive into spirituality. Does that sound okay to you?
Great.
Okay. Hi there, you're listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie Hedges and my very special guest, John Lawyer, who is how do I phrase this? I wrote it, I want to look and put it. He is a previous counterintelligence specialist, that is now a spiritual intelligence specialist. And we've talked about his years in counterintelligence, both with the DOD and in the private sector, and how he did things we only see in movies. And he gave us some insight into that. Now, we finished the first half of the show with him having a Zen therapist that taught him about perceiving life in a whole different way after being broken, as you were broken by the trauma of dealing with issues that he had to deal with. And John, I was thinking about it this way. Personally, I consider myself a pilgrim in Christian mysticism and contemplative spirituality. And one of the primary issues we deal with is what St. John of the Cross calls the annihilation of the ego. That's everything is about me and that I must satisfy all my egoic needs. And you told me that after you were introduced to Eastern spiritual modalities, you found that you had been attached to the things of life, or what I would refer to as ego. What did that look like for you, and what did you do about it? What were the things of life that you found yourself attached to?
Yeah, I really love that part from St. John of the Cross. I identify with that. But those things that I was attached to were material stresses, like, okay, am I going to have enough money tomorrow? Am I going to be able to pay this bill? Am I going to have an okay relationship with this person? I was attached to all this stuff from my past. So I was attached to traumas. I was attached to memories. I was attached to that feeling that I used to have when I was at war, where I was in the middle of it all, in the thick of it, and my brain, like I said, was lit up because it was all very exciting. I was attached to that. I was attached to, probably to a certain extent, I was attached to judgment myself. I was attached to judgment others. I hadn't forgiven myself. I hadn't forgiven others. I was attached to that. So there's all these attachments that I think that I had, and I think that probably a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah, but are just so exacerbated by your circumstances and situations that are much deeper. What did the process, which I imagine as deeply as they are, will be something you'll deal with for a lot of years. What processes did you use or do you use now to remove those needs and those obstacles that get in the way of you pursuing the kind of life that you feel is freer and fuller?
Yeah, freer and fuller. I like that. That's exactly how it should be. First thing I did was surrender to the world, to the universe, and I said, you know what? Really don't care what happened. I wasn't giving up on life. I wasn't done with living, but I really didn't care what happened. And I told myself, you can't care anymore. You're too attached to all this stuff. And so it was surrender. That could be surrender from a Buddhist perspective. It could be surrender like Christ on the cross. You know, there's different types. You can look at it from different perspectives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think with surrender, as part of this letting go process, which is what surrender is, there's also acceptance. You just talked about it. There's stuff that I have that's part of me, this human experience that I'm having, that may never leave me. These memories, these traumas, these things. But when you accept that they're a part of you, and you're surrendering at the same time and letting go, it's pretty amazing.
That's huge. The acceptance, it seems to me, is so essential, and yet if it's acceptance, oftentimes, not oftentimes, always, grand acceptance is accepting things we don't like about ourselves, that we think should be different. And so there are things we have done, things we have thought, that we have to accept. This is who I am. May not be who I am today, but this is part of who I was becoming, part of my growth process. In your situation, I just can't imagine what you had to do to accept that. How does one come about accepting one's own brokenness and severe brokenness. Not that, oh, I told a fib yesterday.
Yeah, I think that's the heart of kind of the spiritual process sometimes. For me, I had to realize, I think one of the important things I realized is that broken as I was, as hard of a thing that I had gone through, that also there's choices involved. There's a choice every moment of every day that I'm living, where I get to choose how I feel about things, how I look at things, how I approach myself in the world. I had to go back and realize that I had made a lot of choices that put me into those situations that I was in. And I didn't ask for it all. I'm not saying that I deserved it all, but that I'd made choices end up there, and had made a choice to join the Army, and I made a choice to stay, and I made a choice to go into war zones, and I made choices to keep doing that. Part of it is because I didn't know any better, and I was drawn to it because it was exciting and all that, but I kept making choices to keep myself in that process. So I think acknowledging that was healthy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I eventually understood I have a choice on whether I succumb to my trauma in a consistent way. I can let trauma control me. I can let the stress and the anxiety and the depression control me, or I can choose to look at everything from a different perspective, and that will lead to healing. So it was I think a really deep dive into looking at the fact that life's a choice.
You're speaking my language, because as my listeners know, I advocate that. I preach that all the time, that life is a choice. We get to choose. Something occurred to me in that I had a question that as I got onto choice, I started thinking about something else. So I have to go back a couple of paragraphs to think because it was important. Oh, recently I did a show with a writer who talked about safe homes, and that safe homes there are in ill weather parts of the country. There are safe homes for children that can go from schools to these homes that are considered safe in the midst of a storm or tornado or whatever. But he goes on and he uses that metaphorically and say all of us need safe homes. We need places we give ourselves, or we discover permission to be exactly who we are. That is the act of surrendering, as you talk about it. But that you in your brokenness, you are safe here. This is a place you are safe. Your brokenness is not a value judgment that you were judged against or for. It's just nothing. It doesn't count, because you're safe here to be who you are. Do you have any place that you would consider to be a safe home for you? Metaphorically, it could be your spiritual life. It could be routines. It could be a number of gardens. It could be a number of things. Do you have what you would call is a safe place, a safe home for your demons?
Yeah, I do. In my house, like my main bedroom, and even bathroom with the bath and the shower, even my closet, I have a chair in my closet. Like I have it's this space where I spend a lot of time. I feel safe there. I feel like stuff's not going to get to me. Actually, the safe home concept, particularly important to me personally. It's important to my wife as well, because she was overseas with me all those years.
Oh, really? Oh, we haven't spoken of your wife. Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, she spent almost all of that time that I was in combat zone. She was, except for a year or two, she was there with me.
Did she have another job, or was she part of the process?
She was part of the process. She was an intelligence analyst.
Oh,
and that was her job. So we had a very similar job.
Okay. Yeah. So I imagine she's a safe place.
She's gone through all this. Yeah, she is a safe place. Like, so her and I together, safety for each other. It's more, over the years, has developed into more of an interdependent, healthy thing versus kind of a maybe not as healthy codependent thing. And so, yeah, and so she's a safe space for me. My house and parts of my house are important. Yeah, I think there's things within the house, like whether it's aromatherapy or candles or
yes,
things that bring you peace, plants. There's absolutely
Yes.
things that contribute to that feeling of belonging that is a safe space. And I believe that our physical spaces are so critical. You mentioned being centered and grounded a while ago. So critical to that aspect of being centered and grounded. If you don't have order these spaces around you, because you are your environment, right? Like
You
we
are,
our
yes.
environment. So yeah, absolutely. I definitely subscribe to the fact safe space. We have to have a place where we can connect with our inner self. We can connect with whatever as universe or nature or the beyond or Christ consciousness or whatever, however we want to say it.
Sure. Our sort of sanctuary space.
Absolutely.
You know, I want to, as we're coming to a close, I want to talk about your business and your ministry, and I'd like to start from what you told me, and as we were talking earlier in the week, and you told me that after 3 years of therapy, you experienced a vision or an awakening, that you had one night that you had this vision or awakening that changed your whole world. I'm very interested in what that was all about.
After I had decided to surrender and let go and all of that, at the time I didn't realize it was a spiritual thing, even though it was. About 3 years ago now, I had this moment of awakening or clarity or understanding. It was late at night. My wife was asleep. And I just understood this oneness of the universe, that we're all connected. It was very loving kindness oriented. Knew my purpose was to help people help themselves. I wanted to go have conversations about my own spiritual journey that I recognized I was on and that was going to continue. And I wanted to hear what others had to say about their own spiritual journeys, and that regardless of what we believed, we could all stand or sit next to each other and have conversations about spirituality, our religion, our thoughts on the universe, our thoughts on the world, our thoughts on ourselves. And it wouldn't matter what denomination or philosophical construct or spiritual idea that we came from.
I love that. There was a friend of mine that gave me a quote that I'm pulling up right now that talked about, here we go. It's from Meister Eckhart, and said, theologians may quarrel, but the mystics speak the same language. I love that, and I think it fits to you, and you might describe what Omnist is, but I think it fits very much in your philosophy or theology, in that we mystics, those who think of God not in such boxed up dogmatic terms, but in an open, loving, kind, generous way, that we do speak the same language. How do you think about that?
I wholeheartedly 100% subscribe to that. And whether it's Christian mysticism or it's other Abrahamic, they all resonate deeply with me. I think you and I, our call a few days ago, I said that I feel more Christian today than I ever did in the Christian church.
Yeah.
Feel closer to Christ and God and the divine. And I feel like the mystics, when you read the teachings of the mystics, yes, they're very much in line with what the Vedas say from Hinduism, and
right.
You read the Pali Canon and Buddha, and in any really religious tradition or spiritual tradition, it really overlaps quite nicely with what the mystics are saying. And I would always take it as a compliment if someone called me a mystic. I think it's probably a great description.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Merton, but he died late 1960s, and he was I'm forgetting the order that he was a part of, but it was a silence order, and they did no talking, but he's a prolific writer and very much on mysticism, and considered probably the top, what we would call contemporary Christian mystic. And Merton became very acquainted with and adept at Zen Buddhism and meditation and prayer of Zen, and that troubled some people in his Christianity, but this is what led Merton into much of his contemplative experiential prayer. And I just love that quote that we all speak the same, that the mystics, and you fall into that category of a mystic, that mystics all speak the same language, and that is the language of the divine or holy, without having to define what that divine or holy is. We instead are more interested in saying, here's my experience with the divine. I may see it through these filters. As I told you, I call Christianity my mother tongue, but I like to try to be able to be somewhat conversant in other languages. That's the area that I hang out with, but it doesn't mean I'm limited, nor do I think that's the only path to the divine.
Yes. Yeah, like I said, I resonate deeply with that, and I love when you talk about multiple paths. There isn't one set path to the divine. The path to the divine, that's what spirituality is all about. The path to the divine is what you determine that it is. Because at the end of the day, that's that self with a capital S inside of us. And self is the divine. That self is the universe. So idea that we're all walking our own unique path is really a celebration and should be celebrated. I think that's what our community that we built was all about.
That sounds great. Let me, as we wind up, I'm going to tell you a tiny story, and then I want your thoughts on it. I read a story of Hermann Hesse, and I don't know if you're familiar with Hermann Hesse. He was an early 20th century writer, and he wrote, when I was a hippie in the 60s, he wrote this book called Siddhartha it was mandatory reading. You read Siddhartha and you read Che Guevara. Those were our guys. And Hermann Hesse experienced World War I, and he was a very strong, I would say Christian, very strong man of God. And the brutality of World War I, and each nation claiming they're fighting under the auspices of the same God, but defined differently, and it just turned him completely off to the notion of a deity. And so he went through, not as an agnostic, through a period of atheism, and then he changed his position, and he got to where, like what you're talking about, the S, the self with the large, with the capital uppercase S, and he wrote, Rilke is very famous for having written Letters to a Young Poet. He wrote Letters to a Young Poet 5 years after Hesse wrote Letters to a Young German. And in this Letters to a Young German, he talked about the God within, and he talked about these beautiful thoughts. Don't look to the pulpit. Don't look necessarily to the scriptures. Don't look to me. Don't look to anybody for your knowledge of God, because God dwells in you. Look inside. Listen to your voice. Listen to the voice of the divine within you. And he writes this much more eloquently than I just said, but I was so moved by it, and it did not get in the way of anything. Me as a Christian did not get in the way of my Christianity, because Jesus is very clear, and St. Paul is very clear on God residing within you. And Peter even writes about that we get to partake in the divine nature, that we are invited to be the fourth person of the Trinity. This oneness is residing in you. We are the temple of God within us, the temple of the divine. And I'm just wondering, as we wrap up, what your thoughts are on Hermann Hesse and my explanation.
I am familiar with Siddhartha and Hermann Hesse, and I think that's a really good story. I didn't realize his background, though. That's actually,
yeah, that was new to me as well.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's great. But I think I think Jesus Christ have been great friends with the Buddha, or a transcended yogi in Hinduism. I think that they would have walked alongside each other as one. And
I love that.
You talked about it. When we remove these human touch points, of dogma and ecclesiastical governing. We remove all that from whatever religion you're talking about, right? You're left with just the base teachings. They do all point in such a similar direction. And you can take just something like the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and you can take that, you can study it and realize that there's a variation of that in Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism and Islam, spirituality, indigenous traditions, and that's right. If you go talk to a Jewish scholar who's studied Torah and the Talmud their entire lives, I'll tell you that many of them will tell you that really golden rule is what it all comes down to. Yeah. Those mitzvahs, those acts of kindness that lift up humanity towards this light, better place. So,
I love
that. I 100% subscribe to that.
I like to, for practical terms, when we say do unto others as we would have them do unto us, that resonates. What resonates even stronger with me, John, is that don't do to others what you wouldn't want them doing to you. And that seems even more powerful. It just says, watch what the hell you're doing, because you are impacting the vitality of another person.
That's right. We don't know where they're coming from. We don't know their story. Also, in addition to that, it really also comes down to self-love. How are you treating yourself? Treat yourself as you would treat other people too, because love yourself completely and wholly, and don't disregard yourself. Always make sure that you love yourself.
Yeah, isn't it the missing piece that's, I think it's being spoken of more today than I've ever read in the last several decades. Jesus, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. There are 3 loves there, and we only talk about 2, the love of God and the love of neighbor. But it is predicated on, the love of neighbor is predicated on love of self. And so we can't ignore that love of self if we want to follow Jesus.
Absolutely.
All right, man. It has been so much fun talking to you. I can talk spirituality, and I just have only probably 24 more questions about counterintelligence, and because that's so fascinating. You are a fascinating human, and thank you for your gift to other people of your life and your devotion to divinity.
Oh, yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show. And I also appreciate the message you're putting out in the world. We need more of it. So thank you for that.
Thanks, brother. Okay, I want to thank John Lawyer for being on the show, and I also want to thank all our listeners for tuning in to the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.